Diagnosis, not definition. A phrase that for me will always go far beyond just three simple words. A phrase that over the last 18 years of my life I've learned to live by. Because for me, it's a phrase that means that as a person on the autism spectrum, I get to be so much more than just another person on the spectrum. For me, it means that I get to do all the things that as a kid I was told were impossible. I would start school on time. I would make it through the normal kid classes. I would graduate high school, again on time, and more than on par with the quote, normal kids. I would go on to attend college, not only as a full-time student, a now rising sophomore at Belmont Abbey College, but also as a member of my school cycling team, which, as many members of the BMX racing community know, is a very hard thing to do, even without a diagnosis. For me, the phrase diagnosis, not definition, is a way to tell all of the people in my life, my friends, my family, most importantly the doubters, that while yes, I may have an autism spectrum disorder, and many things may have seemed impossible for me to do at one point or another, but with the right mindset, anything is possible. With enough hard work and enough dedication, any diagnosis is possible to overcome. So yes, I am on the spectrum, but because I never let my diagnosis define who I was, and I never listened to the people who tried to hold me back because of that diagnosis, my dreams were never out of reach, and I'm now living a life that I've always dreamed of. My life is now what I make it out to be, not what my autism or what the people who always believed that it should hold me back said it should be. Growing up as a child with an autism spectrum disorder, school was always a challenge for me. Even before I started, the doubt in my abilities was always there. I remember a story that my mom always tells me about back in preschool when a teacher once told her that she wasn't sure if I should go on out past pre-K a year or maybe even 2 years after I should have. Because one day, there was a problem. It wasn't even really a problem, just we were all sitting on a carpet that we had in the class, and we were all reading, but the carpet made me incredibly uncomfortable. It was always itchy and scratchy, and it always made me so uncomfortable. So I would always slide back off the carpet and onto the regular tile floor. And because of that difference, just because I had to do things a little bit different than every other kid, and that's just one instance of many stories I've heard. But because of that one difference, she never believed that I would make it. Just like so many others, she wanted to hold me back because, again, she wasn't sure if I could handle being in the environment that school was. And I'll never say that they were right. However, school was always difficult. I was always different, whether it be the way I learned, how I interacted with other kids, or just difficulties being in that social environment. Everything always seemed like it wasn't made for kids like me. I remember a story that my occupational therapist, or not a story, but the way my occupational therapist described it to my mom was that me, with my disability, being out in the world was like being thrown into a pool with a bunch of other kids. Except for me, there was a cinder block tied to my ankle. So I knew that school wasn't made for kids like me. And I was always scared that I would fall behind and just not be able to keep up because of this figurative cinder block. And it was never that I couldn't keep swimming, or that I couldn't do school, or that I couldn't keep up, but it was just that constant thought process that everyone put into my mind, this figurative cinder block, that I couldn't keep up, or that I would never be able to be with the rest of the other kids. And then you put on top of that the fact that, making friends was always difficult for me. I was always different, like I said. And most days it felt like all the other kids could see right through any method of acting normal that I'd come up with. Even just talking to a kid who I sat next to every other day of that school year, it would make my heart race. My chest would tighten up. It was almost like a nightmare, just having a conversation with that kid I sat next to every day. I didn't know at the time now, but I've learned that for a kid like me, that was normal. trying to figure out how to seem normal to others was always scary, but I would always have to put on a mask. I would always have to become an entirely different person just to speak. And that was just the way it was for me. I had this cinder block tied to my ankle, and I would always have to swim twice as hard as the rest of the kids just to stay afloat. But I did it. I made it through school, and like I said, I graduated high school, and I went on to college. And this cinder block is still there. But since, as a kid, I always kept swimming, I always kept pushing, and I always kept working hard, I can barely feel it. I go through college, and now when people find out that I'm on the spectrum, it's hard for them to believe. Because as a kid, I never gave up. I never let my diagnosis define what I could do. I never let this cinder block hold me back. I never let it pull me underwater. I always kept swimming, and I always stayed afloat. And I did it. Like I said, I never let my diagnosis define who I was or what I could do. Growing up, I've always played sports. Football, baseball. I mean, I was even on a kids' bowling league at one point. Like, I loved sports. I remember in my old neighborhood, I would go out with my group of 3 other friends, and especially during the summer, we would play a different sport every day. One day it'd be baseball, then we'd be playing basketball, and then football. We were always playing sports. But it was something about actually joining a football team or actually joining a baseball team that just never suited me. Very similar to my issues with school, I was always so different from everyone else. And not physically, but mentally, I was always different. I was always the odd one out. Making friends was, again, very difficult for me. And it almost led me to a sort of hatred for these sports. Nothing seemed to work for me. Until I was 11 years old and I was introduced to the sport of BMX racing. For those of you who don't know, real quick, BMX stands for bicycle motocross, and it is very similar to dirt bike racing in a way, but the tracks are a lot smaller, and we use actual pedal bikes. Like you can see behind me, this is my actual race bike. And at first I was just so excited to finally start racing, because growing up, that was what I always loved. Car racing, motorcycle racing, dirt bike racing, just any form of racing fascinated me. I loved it. But for us, it was always a little too expensive. So once I found BMX, it was finally a way for me to get to go on and race in the way that I had always wanted to. And at first, it was nothing more than that. For me, it was nothing more than just a way for me to race. But for my parents and my teachers, it was almost an instant difference in me. At the time, like I said, I really had no idea, but to everyone around me, I became way more social. My grades improved. I started making friends far easier than I thought was ever possible. And the only thing that changed was BMX racing. BMX from the start was always so different from every other sport. Your riding was always an expression of just you, not your team, but yourself. You work for yourself. There aren't teams out on the track. It's just you. For me, I believe that was always kind of the most crucial part about racing. It was always a place where, outside of people who just watched, there weren't really critics. Once you're in that group and once you're on the track, there's really no incorrect way to ride. You just find what's fastest for you, and that's, in most cases, that's celebrated. Because if you can go out there and do something else that no one else is doing, or that no one else has even thought of, and it makes you faster than everyone else, everyone will be all over you. Want to know exactly what you did and how you did it and how it made you faster. And, because of this, making friends at a BMX track is almost inevitable. No one seems to care about differences. We all share the common desire to just go as fast as we could on little BMX bikes. And at first I hadn't noticed, but looking back now, I realized that being in this environment, I learned a lot. I learned that being different is okay. Being different should be celebrated. It's okay to be yourself and to be who you are, and you should never be scared to showcase your differences. Because in BMX, that's what makes you faster. But in life, those differences are what make the world go round. having people of all different backgrounds who share all sorts of different writing styles is very similar to how in real life, having people of all different backgrounds is what makes the world go round. It's what makes the world grow into a better place. BMX taught me to love yourself and to love the differences of everyone. It taught me that just because someone's different than me doesn't make me better than them, and it doesn't make them better than me. That we're all equal and we're all beautiful, and that all of our differences shouldn't put us in different categories, but should be celebrated, should be loved. And those differences should be exposed to show that just because someone isn't the same as you doesn't mean that they're not as good as you. It just means that they're different. And just because they do things differently doesn't mean that they can't get the job done. Differences should be celebrated. What makes you different is what makes you special. What makes you do things differently from everyone else is how problems get solved. Your different point of view should be so much more than celebrated. And if you don't take anything else from this, I want you to take that just because you're different, you're still an amazing person and you still matter. And again, these lessons that I took from BMX racing and just life in general, and this phrase, diagnosis not definition, has put my life on a completely different path. I went from a kid who no one thought would graduate high school, on time at least, if I did it at all, to a kid who no one ever thought would make it to college, to a kid who no one thought would be able to make it in the world alone, or even with assistance, to a high school graduate, class of 2019, right on time, to again a now rising sophomore at Belmont Abbey College, where I have so many friends who at this point are more family than anything, to a now member of a cycling team, which was a dream of mine ever since I started racing, to join a collegiate cycling team and get to go to college as an athlete. Not letting your diagnosis define who you are was the best choice anyone could ever make, because it shows that you get to live life how you want to live, not how somebody who says that you have autism or any other disability believes that you have to live. Having a diagnosis shouldn't hold you back. It should push you further out. Having a diagnosis is a way to, for me at least, was a way to make a change. I've now started my own nonprofit where we teach kids that lesson of just because you're different doesn't mean you're worth less. It honestly, you should go out there and expose your differences, because you can teach the world so much about just how much a little kid from Delaware with autism can do, as long as you never let your diagnosis define you and you always put in the work and you just always live your life the way you want it to be, never in the way that somebody else tells you it should be. Never let your diagnosis define who you are. Thank you.